Hi, welcome back to Fundamental Theology. Last time we talked about original sin and its consequences. One of the points we made was that original sin had a social aspect. It had a communal aspect to it. For this reason, original sin is actually good news. It's good news because if the fault of one person can be communicated in some sense to another, that is to say, if the unrighteousness of one could implicate others, as in fact is clearly the case, according to the teaching of the Church, in the case of the first man and the first woman relative to the rest of humanity, then it might also be the case that the righteousness of one person can in some way implicate others. So that if sin is in this sense contagious, so also is righteousness. The good news there is that sin need not be the last word in a person's life. This is a very interesting idea, and I'm not going to go into great depth about the metaphysics here about original sin, if we want to put it that way. But I do want to talk about the aspect here that leads to an optimistic view of reality. So what we're talking about here is this projection into the future of a person who might come with some superabundance, right, of his personhood and of his righteousness, which could then be communicated, right, transferred in a sense to others, even as he absorbs the implications of the sinfulness of those whom he encounters. But because he himself is so radically unbounded and inexhaustible, then what occurs is that the implications of the other's sin never undermines his own righteousness. So when we see in the scriptures language like, he who was not sin became sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Yet Christ is like us in all ways but sin, driving at the point that when he takes upon himself the sins of the world, he himself does not become, in fact, a sinner, though he's treated as if he were a sinner, though he bears the implications of our sin, even to the point of suffering death on a cross, and descending into hell. Nonetheless, he himself is not a sinner in the sense of being somehow fractured in his personal integrity and being alienated from God and from himself, from others, and from the created order. Rather, he is the remedy of all of that alienation that we experience. So that's the good news about original sin, the happiness of this fall. If this is the way sin is, then redemption is in fact possible. But what else does this teach us? It teaches us that the past does not bind the future in an absolute way. It means that the past can be transmuted by some future event. What this means, ultimately, is that, once again, redemption is possible, or, leaving aside the personal dimension of redemption through the action of a redeemer, and I'm not denying that that's, of course, essential, but just leaving aside that aspect of the problem, what we're addressing is that somehow there's a recontextualization of the events of the past that can occur because of the power of God intervening in the world. So we're getting at here what turns out to be the difference between what Pope John Paul II had called the culture of death on the one hand, and the culture of life on the other. We talked a little bit about this before when we talked about the two ways. The two ways are representative of this exact problem, right? The culture of death on the one hand, the culture of life on the other. And it all has to do, which culture I'm in, has to do with my perspective on reality. It has to do with whether I embrace this revelation about God or if I do not. If I don't, I belong in the culture of death. If I do, I belong in the culture of life. And here's why. Because if Yahweh Elohim is the truth about the world, if it's the truth about reality, right? If it is fundamentally the case that everything that you and I experience in the contingent world, that contingency itself, right, is rooted in the absolute, unbounded love of a faithful and good God who thinks and wills that which is other than himself. If it is true that the world is loved into being by God, then death does not delimit life. Rather, life delimits death. Sin doesn't dictate the last word in a person's moral life. Rather, mercy does. God's desire to redeem and to save and to bless. Sin can be overcome by righteousness even after sin occurs. So what you have in the absence of this God is a world, and we've talked about this before, right? A world of limitation, a world of rivalry, a world in which there are adversarial relationships, a world in which there's only so much to go around, so much food, so much life, so much goodness, so much righteousness. There's a fixed pie, a zero-sum game that we're playing in life. And we have to divide it up among all the contenders. This leads to the culture of death, because what happens in a world in which the presumption of limitation of all resources, including human energies, including love, including mercy and forgiveness, leads to a world in which morality must stake out a place for itself within those boundaries. So it gives death and sin, it gives evil a place at the table in moral discourse. It involves death. It involves Satan, to put it in the terms that we might use as believers, right? It involves Satan in the moral discussion. He has a say, in fact, in how things go. So, for example, in the culture of death, medicine might be understood as having its primary purpose in the eradication of disease. But when a disease presents itself with such force that we have no other means by which to defeat it, we can, in fact, sacrifice the patient himself to defeat the disease. And this is precisely what occurs in active euthanasia. Whereas, from the point of view of the culture of life, one would say that the promotion of the health of the patient is the purpose of medicine, not primarily to eradicate disease. God will take care of that in the end, in some way, through the mystery of the resurrection of the body, which you and I at the moment cannot really comprehend. So even if we die on the other side of death, there is new opportunity. There is life. We live in that hope, and thus there's never a point at which we have to compromise with death, with the threat of death, with the fear of death, with the prospect that in the one life alone that I have to live, it may turn out in a way that I find unbearable. No, because even if In the worst case scenario, I might live yet another 50 years or so in misery. After that, if I can endure it, I will enjoy never-ending bliss. In the culture of death, that can't be said. Rather, we would say, you have but one life to live. You might as well enjoy it. And if it descends into abject suffering, it would really be better simply to bring it to an end. There's the dichotomy in very practical terms. And I think that if we think about it this way, we can see rather clearly many of the lines in contemporary moral and ethical debates, debates over politics and social policy, that we face in the news all the time. Do we think with the culture of life or the culture of death?